Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. Good evening. My name is Jenna Burbich, and I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. The Council is an independent and non-partisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. This event is on the record. We are live streaming, and we welcome your social media engagement. Later, we will be taking questions from the room and online at chi.cnf.io. Finally, to say a few more words about the topic today and to welcome our speaker, I would like to introduce and welcome to the stage Council Board Member John de Blasio. He is the founder and executive director of the GPD Charitable Trust, as well as managing director for Bootstrap Capital, LLC. He is a West Point graduate who retired as Army Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve Civil Affairs Branch and was deployed to the Middle East from 2003 to 2004. John has lived and worked in Europe and the Middle East. In 2006, he was appointed as member of the U.S.-Iraq Business Dialogue and serves on the board of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, as well as several nonprofits. I will be back to moderate the audience Q&A, but for now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John de Blasio. Thank you.
We'll be live tweeting as well. Wow.
Thanks, Anna. Well, welcome. I am John de Blasio, founder of the GPD Charitable Trust, but also had served as a civil affairs officer in Iraq in 2003, 2004. And when I saw that Ed Husain was coming, I thought, what a great opportunity to come and introduce him, because he's such an expert on the topic of sectarianization and how sectarian identification in politics can drive the conflicts that we're seeing in the Middle East. So I thought I would come and make the introduction. And it really, I think we look at the sectarian identification point, Sunni-Shia, almost as a simple reduction of the view of our history of conflict in Europe, and we look at Protestant Catholicism and the changes in in Christianity, and we try to identify it with what's happening in the Middle East, and it's much deeper than that. And I think what we see is the analogies are that political actors take advantage of religious identification to create communities which are then used for their own local purposes and individual gains. That analogy exists, but there is much deeper identification through national identities and other factors. When I came to Iraq in 2003, no one identified themselves as Shia or Sunni or Kurd. In fact, they would be insulted if you asked. They were Iraqis, and they were Iraqis first. And now, after 9 years or 10 years or in 2006 or 2007, everyone began to identify themselves first by their sect, and you watch that process of sectarianization. And I think what's interesting about Ed's research and his expertise is that you begin to understand how that process occurs, but also that it can unwind. It is a process of sectarianization and de-sectarianization, and that's the hope that I think the Middle East holds, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. Ed Husain is a global fellow on the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. He speaks extensively on international threats from radicalization and terrorism. Previously, he served as a senior advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and was a former senior fellow for Middle East Region Studies at CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. He holds an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from SOAS University in London and is the author of the best-selling book, The Islamist, which is a finalist for the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing, as well as the recently published new book titled House of Islam, A Global History, that will be available for sale and signing from the bookseller after the program. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ed Husain.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for making time, and thank you, John, for a very warm welcome.
We're living in interesting times across the world, but particularly here in the US. I've just come from Washington, D.C. I'm on my way to LA, and my sense is that the bandwidth for conversation is somewhat limited here in the US, with focusing on one issue, one individual, one city, and the ramifications around the country. So I appreciate the fact that you've extended your bandwidth to have a much broader, wider conversation that's actually bigger than the incumbent at a certain building, not too far from the Atlantic. I want to also thank the Atlantic Council for making time, forgive me, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I was speaking with John earlier, and he's on the board of the Atlantic Council, so it's in my mind. But thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and to Jenna and her team in particular for making all this happen. When I started to go out to the Middle East aged around 18, we used to hear of something called sushi marriages. Ring any bells? Anyone want to identify what it means? Yeah, it was a Sunni and Shia marriage, and it used to be called sushi marriages, and it was fairly widespread. It was an understood practice, and people were comfortable with speaking about it. Now it's a whole different story. It's rare to find sushi marriages, and when there's sushi dating, Sunni-Shia dating, it leads to all kinds of problems. And I will come to the sushi details in a moment. But I want to do 4 things in the 25 minutes or so that I will speak, and then open up to questions and comments, agreements, disagreements, criticisms, and whatnot from you. First, I want to speak about the genesis of this conflict, the Sunni-Shia conflict. Secondly, Saudi Arabia and its role today, but also more recently in a little history. Thirdly, Iran and its contribution to this global war. And fourthly, where we are now and where we're heading, and what it means for redrawing maps or otherwise of the Middle East. Now, the word Sunni comes from Sunnah, or the mainstream Muslim majority that adhere to the way of the Prophet. Some say it's the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, some say it's just the Sunnah, but shortened for Sunni. In Syria, where I spent about 2.5 years, most people would identify themselves as being of the Sunnah, but in Pakistan they call themselves of being Sunni. That influence perhaps on the British imperial forces, and then by extension in the English language, we use the word Sunni to talk about the majority of Muslims. Round about the 85 to 90% mark of the world's Muslims are Sunni. Now, then there's the Shia. Shia in Arabic means community, but they were originally called Shia of Ali, or Imam Ali, the 4th Caliph, the cousin of the Prophet, the wife of Fatima, his daughter, the father of Hassan and Husain, the Prophet's beloved grandsons. Now, Imam Ali is the 4th Caliph. Historically, factually, that's what happened. But the Shia of the community, or the Shia of Ali, in English we call Shiite, but the Shia of Ali wanted him to be the 1st Caliph. And from the very beginning of Islam, this conflict around political power, after the passing of the Prophet in the year 632, this conflict started in relation to the followers of Imam Ali, saying he is much more mystical, he is the chosen son-in-law of the Prophet, he is the father of Hassan and Husain, the beloved grandsons of the Prophet. And since the Prophet Muhammad did not have a son, his son-in-law, who was a very early Muslim from a very young age, should be the heir, the continuation of this divine mission of the Prophet. The majority of the Muslims at the time disagreed with that, and they said, no, Islam is not about a dynasty, it's about meritocracy. And Abu Bakr, who was the Prophet's best friend in his early 60s, and a major sponsor of the Prophet's Islamic mission, he should be the Caliph. Now, fast forward to the year 680, what happens is Imam Ali's son, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Imam Husain, is killed in the Battle of Karbala. Now, I go into great depth about this in my most recent book, so I won't go into excessive details here, other than to say that the conflict that was previously political between Imam Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, and the 4th Caliph, now become something much more physical, much more intense, because Imam Husain is killed by the then Caliph Yazid, son of Muawiyah. Most Muslims at the time disagreed with that, but most were silent and didn't want to rise against that. But Imam Husain, the Prophet's grandson, rose against that force. Now, some would say it was about power, others would say it was about social justice. This was his grandfather's faith tradition, and he was the rightful heir to the Islamic empire. Karbala is in Iraq. John mentioned Iraq, I will come back to that in a moment. But it was at the Battle of Karbala, the killing of Imam Husain, 55 years old. He had about 70 people with him. The vast majority of the Muslim cities at the time let him down, and it was the killing of someone who was from the Prophet's lineage. I mean, imagine Jesus had a grandson, and that grandson was killed by the followers of Jesus. Or imagine Moses had a grandson, and Moses' family was killed. Think about it in those terms. So Muhammad's own grandson is being killed by Muslims. This is the legacy of the caliphate from the very beginning. Today's world is full of the blood and the seeking of the caliphate, but this blood starts in the very early days of Islam in contradiction to the teachings of the Prophet in not to spill blood. So the seeking of political power, worldly power, right from the passing of the Prophet Muhammad's mission, that was a divine mission, was very quickly corrupted by the Umayyad Caliphate and the subsequent caliphates. The Abbasids, for example, and others followed the Shia tradition, but the Ottomans, the Mughals, and a whole range of other Muslim empires always stuck to the mainstream Sunni majority tradition. Now, I don't want to continue in that vein for the next 1300 years, but I'll come very quickly to Saudi Arabia today. And those of you who are interested in the detail, the color, the pain, the mercy, the compassion, the humiliation of early Muslim history all the way down to today's time, I detail that in the book. But Saudi Arabia is founded as a state in 1932. In the 1940s, your country, my country previous to that, had very close relationship with the Saudi monarchy. But Saudi Arabia's story does not start in 1932. Saudi Arabia's story starts for 150 years or so before that, in the 1750s, for example, when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi sect within Islam, starts his mission as a Protestant organization, as a Protestant leader against the mainstream Sunni Hanafi Ottoman Empire. Ibn Abdul Wahhab in the Najd, in central Arabia, in the desert, did not approve of Sufi shrines or mysticism or calligraphy or art or architecture. He had this notion of an Islam that was free from the influences of the Byzantines, the Greeks, the Christians, and wanted to return to an imagined form of 7th century Islam. So he actively starts to attack any manifestation of beauty, music, and as I say, mosques that were decorated. But he specifically goes after Shia Muslim communities in Arabia, but also elsewhere. In 1801, the second member of the Saudi then royal family, go all the way to Karbala in Iraq and attack that city, the Karbala that I mentioned where Imam Husain was killed. Karbala now is a holy city for most Shia Muslims, and the Wahhabis from Najd go there and they raid. I think they had about 12,000 soldiers with them in 1801, and they go and they attack and they raid Karbala, come back. Now, some say it was because their shrines had a lot of gold. Some say because it was a large city and they could rape and pillage. Whatever the reason, there was a sectarian dimension to it. There were many other cities in Iraq that they could have targeted, but why Karbala in 1801? Now, Saudi Arabia, sorry, in 1802, forgive me. In Saudi Arabia, the government to this day is formed on the basis of an alliance between this Wahhabi family of al-Sheikh and the Al Saud royal family now. So they did a deal, I think it was in 1757 if I'm not mistaken, and that contract still stands between the religious clerics that are dominated by the Wahhabi, extreme, puritanical, literalist, confrontational sect. All of those traits we see very early on against mainstream Muslims, i.e. the Ottomans, and killing and pillaging any Muslim that disagreed with them, including, by the way, those in Mecca and Medina. And then you have the Saudi royal family that basically wanted worldly power, and they were prepared to do a deal with this sect that gave them secular power, but insisted that the domain of religion and preaching remained with the house of Abdul Wahhab or the Wahhabis. Since the 1960s, Wahhabism has been sponsored by Saudi Arabia. It's, in your country, the worst manifestation has been the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Across the Middle East, now ISIS. All of that is a reflection of that literalist reading of early Muslim scripture, devoid of context and rejecting of the traditions that were built up by many Muslim scholars, from Ibn Abbas, one of the early commentators of the Quran, all the way down. You look at that tradition, you don't find more than 3 to 4 Muslim scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyum, a couple of others, and then Ibn Abdul Wahhab. You look at mainstream Muslim scholarship, you find tens of thousands of big, powerful, giant scholarship names. So all of that was disregarded because it was too influenced by everybody else, and an imagined return to an imagined year zero in Islam. So that's Saudi Arabia, built on the premise of Wahhabism, built on rejecting mainstream Islam, but also rejecting the Shia. So there was a sectarian drive. The good news is that in the last year or so, we are seeing change in Saudi Arabia. And in the interest of fairness, I should say that Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince, recognizes this narrative that I've just outlined to you, admits that Saudi Arabia has been part of a problem since the 1960s at least onwards, with the Muslim World League and others financing global extremism that leads to terrorism. So we have good news coming out of Saudi Arabia in the last few months, that there's a commitment at least to reform. Time will tell whether we see him A, survive, and B, deliver. But on balance, it ought to be applauded, because there's a recognition for those of us who have been shouting for years about controlling and containing extremism in Saudi Arabia. We now see movement in the Riyadh, and that's got to be welcomed. Now, as Saudi Arabia winds down, we then have my third point, which is the rise of Iran. Now, Iran was not always Shia. You know, Iran, for its previous history, was Zoroastrian. In the early days of Muslim conquest, Iran was a Sunni Muslim country. Iran gave us great Muslim luminaries, many more so than the entire Najd, or that part of Arabia where Saudi Arabia is born. In my mind, I have someone like Omar Khayyam, for example, a great poet, philosopher. I think he died in somewhere in the 11th century, so pretty early on in Islam. And Khayyam is translated by Fitzgerald in the last century. So a huge figure. You have Hafiz, a great poet, translated here in the US. But my point is that they were not Shia, they were not extremists, they were pluralist, compassionate, kind Muslim scholars, reflecting a confident Muslim civilization in Persia. Khayyam famously drank. Khayyam wrote those famous quatrains. Khayyam was known to be absorbed in philosophy, but also theology. Hafiz wrote about making love to God. I mean, today's Muslim Puritans have heart attacks hearing those kind of lines that Hafiz put out. And he wrote in beautiful Persian about how he had fallen in love with God, and there's a long story how he gets there. Again, someone I write about in the book, but Hafiz accuses God of leaving a bastard child, which is his broken heart, because having made love to God, God then disappeared from his life. So that kind of poetry coming out in the 1300s from Iran or Persia is phenomenal. But in 1501, the Safavi king, ruler, Shah, conquers Iran, and from that point onwards, so it's pretty recent, in the 16th century, you've got the Protestant movement on the rise in Europe, but also concurrently in Persia, you've got this state imposition from the very top of Shia Islam. And Shia Islam in and of itself is not a problem. So I would like to fast forward all the way to 1979 and say broadly, yes, the Iranian or the Safavi Shia regime in Isfahan had many problems with the Ottomans, another mainstream Sunni empire. But by and large, other than that tension, and the Ottomans beat them on multiple occasions, you don't find this sectarian problem of the gravitas that we see from 1979 onwards. So what happens in 1979? The Iranian Revolution, too often called an Islamic revolution, but it's more accurately called the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini is hugely influenced by Marxist thinkers, believes in this very statist form of Islam. Previously, the Shia tradition believed that Islam as a state power could not appear until the Mahdi or the chosen leader or the secret leader, depending on which variation of the Shia you believe in. But there's a mainstream Shia belief that there will be a return of a Mahdi or a Messiah figure in the end times. And once the Messiah is here, the Messiah takes control of the state or the government. And in the meantime, the clerics should not be involved in governing. It's the duty of politicians and monarchs and kings and whatnot to govern. So you could argue that it was broadly secular. There was a clear division. 1979 changes that. Ayatollah Khomeini, interestingly, in exile in Paris, returns to Iran, in Tehran, and unlike the previous consensus, and unlike mainstream Shia Muslims in Iraq, in Lebanon, and elsewhere who believe in the separation of powers, he says, in the absence of the Mahdi, we can no longer wait for this Mahdi or the Messiah. In the absence of the Mahdi, we need to, as religious leaders, be in power. So Ruhullah Khomeini, no one called him an Ayatollah or even Imam, we gave him those titles. He is now in power, and he will implement Sharia as he understands it. So women wearing the veil and all other forms of laws are imposed from Tehran by a religious cleric for the first time in Shia history. Now, this is an aberration. This is an abnormality. What we have in Iran now is not in keeping with mainstream Shia Islam for the last 1,300 years, or even the last 400 years, and a perversion of Islam in Iran, which before the Safavid invasion was not the Iranian or the Persian form of Islam. Now, so that's the first component of the Iranian ideology, i.e. the Mahdi is imminent and he is arriving, and we are all acting, especially the clerics, in the absence of that Mahdi. That ideology called wilayat al-faqih, or the keeping in the Wilayat basically means the responsibility or the keeping of power of the faqih or the jurist before the Mahdi comes. That's a new invention, Wilayat al-Faqih. You search ancient Muslim texts and you don't find that. If you said to the Prophet Muhammad or even Imam Ali, what about Wilayat al-Faqih, they would be gobsmacked. They would not know what that means. So this is a second component of the Iranian revolutionary ideology. The third component is that there is a desire to export that revolution, much like the Soviet Union. It's just not good enough to have that within the Iranian borders. It's a revolutionary exporting ideology, which means it also claims Bahrain, it claims parts of Saudi Arabia, it claims parts of Kuwait, parts of the United Arab Emirates as Persian territory. And it seeks to dominate those neighbors, and it has done so since the beginning of the founding of the modern state. And finally, it sees itself in this end of times battle. Just as the Mahdi is about to arrive and is imminent. By the way, Ahmadinejad thought Mahdi was going to arrive in the first 2 years of him being president. And I mean, this is documented on multiple occasions. He would have disputes with the head Khamenei, the current supreme leader, saying within 2 years the Mahdi would be here. It's hard for us to understand this in this kind of post-secular, post-ideological, post-theological world, but these are deeply ingrained beliefs in especially among Shia Muslims, that Mahdi is imminent. So on the fourth element is that given that Mahdi is about to arrive, given that Iran is preparing for the final battle, there's a battle Manichaean between evil and between good. And Iran represents the good and the godly forces, and the West and its allies, the great devil, the great Satan, this great country, and its ally, i.e. Israel and others around the world, and it's particularly Britain, by the way, because of the 1953 revolution, the overthrow of General Mossadegh. But these three countries, the UK, the US, and Israel, increasingly others, are part of this great evil empire that the Iranian government is in a long-term showdown against. So those are the first three components. The beginning, i.e. the genesis with Karbala, Imam Husain. Secondly, Saudi Arabia and its ideology and changes there. And I've just highlighted to you the 3 or 4 components of the Iranian ideology that's expansionist, which brings us neatly to my final point, which is where are we now, and what does the future look like? John kindly mentioned Iraq, and I think that was a seminal moment for the Iranians to spread beyond where they were previously in Iran. And Iraq was as you know, a Sunni majority, a Shia majority country controlled by Saddam Hussein, who was from a Sunni background. The removal of Saddam gave Iran the confidence and the vacuum to move many of its soldiers, supporters, foot soldiers, proxies and others into Iraq. And I think it was King Abdullah of Jordan in 2004 was the first to identify this when he talked about a Shia crescent. And he said that and by Shia crescent, he's not speaking against ordinary Shia people, but the government in Tehran and this Wilayat al-Faqih model that they seek to export, that from Iran, you had this Shia militancy moving into Iraq, and from Iraq, increasingly into Syria, and quite freely, because the Assad government, the son, Bashar al-Assad, not the father, gave a lot of movement, and I saw this personally when I was living in Syria between 2005 and 2007, and it moves from, the Shia crescent moves from Damascus and Syria into Lebanon. So this was the crescent that was emerging, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, from 2003, 2004 onwards. Now this was 14, 15 years ago, and what was a crescent is now half moon, if you like, because the influence has moved further south, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, what's very interesting is John Sawyer, who was then ambassador to Egypt, but a senior political director at the British Foreign Office, then became MI6's director, I think in the year 2011. But in 2005, he receives a delegation from Iran. The meeting was with Iranians from the government. And remember at that point, and even now, you in the US do not have diplomatic relations with the Iranians. So we were seen in the UK as a back channel for you. So John Sawyer, political director at the Foreign Office, previously ambassador to Egypt, meets an Iranian high-level delegation, and they have this to say to him. And remember, this is in the midst of the Iraq war, and thousands of US, UK, and other coalition forces are being killed in Iraq, and the Iranian delegation says to John Sawyer that we want to do a deal with you, i.e. the West, that we will stop killing you in Iraq, provided you give us space to develop our nuclear weapons program. Now think about the calculation behind that mindset. It comes to a Brit at the highest level of the Foreign Office, admits without even being asked that the Iranians are behind the killing of coalition forces in Iraq, and then says we will stop that, but we want a longer term prize, and a much bigger prize, our nuclear program. It begs the question why on multiple occasions, and I'll leave you to do the calculation. John Sawyer then becomes director of MI6. John Sawyer said this very publicly in a BBC interview, I think in 2011. It was vociferously denied by the Iranians, but of course it would be denied, wouldn't it? I mean, at that level of admission. Now, the last couple of points I want to make is that the Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, in 2006, very famously said, 2006, 2007, very famously said that Iran's borders are now actually with us here in Egypt because of Gaza. In other words, the Iranian funding and financing of Hamas led to the Egyptian president saying, we now have an active border with Iran. Just think about the mindset of a country like Iran, of Egypt, that has no borders, now thinks that it has borders. So at government level, with the Iranians, there are multiple problems that we have across the Middle East, sectarian tensions on the rise. Iran has difficulties, one, with Saudi Arabia and the eastern province. Iran meddles actively in Bahrain, where there's a Shia majority governed by the Sunni royal family. Iran is now active in Yemen with the Houthi rebels. Iran is active, you could say it controls and commands Syria. Iran is now in control of the airport, by extension, the government via Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I've just laid out 5 countries off the top of my Iraq, 6, hugely influential, not with the current government, but many other tentacles operate in Iran. So 6 governments controlled, influenced, attempts to subvert, protect directly from Tehran. Now, it's not just governments that fear Iran. It's not just the tens of thousands of people that have been killed in Syria by the forces who are supporting Bashar al-Assad and innocent lives that were lost on both sides. It's not just the acrimony with the West and Israel and the attempts to export the Shia form of extremism into Pakistan, into Turkey, into Nigeria. But there is also this non-government activity that's led by Hezbollah, that's led by Hizb al-Wifaq, that's led by Islamic Jihad, that's led by Hamas. So my broad point is that as Sunni extremism, sponsored by Saudi Arabia, is dialed down, what we've got going on across the Middle East with the sponsoring of Iran is a form of Shia extremism and sectarianism being dialed up. And I'll end by saying that here in the West, but especially in your country more specifically, what you say, what you do matters. And what comes out of this country's media, your government, your civil society is watched very, very closely in the Middle East. And we have serious questions and serious reasons to be concerned, given the Iranian expansion and its influence around the region and more widely, but also given the current strategy of the Iranians to get closer to the Turkish government, to be in the orbit of the Russian influence, and take head-on multiple conflict scenes in the region and try to not just intimidate, but bring down allies such as the Israelis, the Saudis, and others. So there's every reason to be concerned about the direction of travel that Iran is taking. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that. Even today in Iran, there were large protests against the government. So Iran is a country, and sectarianism that it sponsors and reactions to it from the Sunni world are something that we should continuously be vigilant about, because it's not going to go away anytime soon. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Ed. We have some time for some questions now. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Wait for me to call on you. Please speak into the microphone, and of course, make sure your question is a question. Okay, let's begin with Adele Simmons at the front here, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Adele, just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about what, in an ideal world, which we don't have now, of U.S. policy might be in this circumstance?
Forgive me for just taking about 3 minutes to answer this question. And this is a great question, because it talks about what the Middle East should look like, because I've outlined to you what it currently looks like. And the prognosis is not optimistic. You know, I mean, Richard Haas, my old boss at CFR, used to always say the Middle East gets worse before it gets worse. And that doesn't echo well with an American public and an American body politic that always looks optimistically around the world. But not every part of the world possesses the DNA that this country possesses. That happens to be different. Now, what should the Middle East look like? Very briefly, and the answer that I'm about to give to you, I mean, doesn't look in the next 3 or 4 years. I'm trying to forecast in the next 25, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, and that's how the US policy should look like. And that is, look at your own country. You know, you're a union of many, many states. Look at the European Union. It went through the very difficulties that the Middle East is going through today. And you look at every front. You want to give me religious extremism? We had that in the bucket loads in Europe for centuries. The 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, even further back, the Crusades that rape and pillage across Europe before they get into the Middle East. You want to talk about dictatorships and tyranny? Well, we had kings and queens that were tyrants, but we also had European fascist dictatorships. You want to talk about the lack of democracy? We had that. You want to talk about political extremism, religious bigotry? Think no further than Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and the fascists and the intolerance of the Jewish people in the European continent in the last century. So we've had all of the problems that the Middle East is currently going through, and yet the European Union was a peace project. You know, multiple countries coming together because they had multiple responsibilities for the same issues. So in sum, what I'm saying is that the Middle East's problem are all of them, water shortage, the youth bulge, high unemployment, the rise of terrorism, extremism across borders, I mean, you name it, fragile, all of those are regional problems. Our mistake in the US and the UK and more broadly the West has been to focus on individual countries. And we're not going to find a lasting solution. So again, in the book, I talk about the need for a Middle East union. And in the long term, what we need to think about is how you reunify a region that was broadly united for 700 years. The nation-state concept is a modern European concept that was born out of France. It hasn't worked in the Middle East, and we need to rethink the future of the Middle East based on the difficulties that we had in Europe. If it worked in Europe, and you speak to Middle Eastern rulers, and I catalogue many of them in the book, they all ask for some form of unity. But we in the West don't understand that impulse. And I'll end this answer by saying that one of the things that the European Union gave most Europeans was another place in the world. It gave the Europeans a sense of dignity and purpose, and the Europeans stood with all of our problems almost as an equal to other blocs in the world. The Arabs are a warrior people. The Middle Easterners have a long history of dignity. That dignity no longer exists, and again there's humiliation. Even today's World Cup match between the Egyptians and the Saudis was an exercise in humiliation. And that humiliation, I mean, read Plato and what he says about thumos, it does something to a people. So I don't want to take up too much time other than to say that we've got to take a much long-term view rather than the short-term tactical views that have informed our policies so far.
Yes, Mr. Porat on the second row, right here, the front. Yeah, second row. Just wait for the microphone. There it is.
Thank you for your analysis. Two questions, actually, somewhat related. One is you mentioned only in passing the new powerful dictators that was elected this Sunday in Turkey. What do you see the role that Turkey will play in this conflict? And second part, you mentioned a couple of times Israel. What role do you see Israel playing in it in the next few years?
Yeah, a great question. Turkey is a tough one. It's a really tough country. It's a NATO member. Without Turkey's influence in the region, the region would be much messier. We in the West have always had difficulties with Turkey. This is not new. I mean, the tensions with Turkey have been going on for at least 1,100 years. It's an old problem, and it fluctuates. Now, the Turks are very famous for hedging their bets, and Turks respect strength. And it's not an accident that Ataturk was a strongman leader, and it's not an accident that 52% of the population votes for Erdogan yet again, because they admire strength. And the European impulse so far has been the total opposite. And we no longer understand the cultural and other dynamics that are at play in Turkey. And I say all this just to emphasize the fact that Turkey can be and should be a country that's closer to the West than it is to the Russians and the Iranians. Sadly, Turkey's current trajectory is moving ever closer to the Russians and flirting too often with the Iranians for our comfort. Don't forget that the Iranians and the Turks were on opposite sides in Syria. So there's every reason for Turkey to be much more closely aligned to us in the West. But in the mind of the current administration in Turkey, they complain about the Gulen movement that's based out of Pennsylvania, according to the government in Istanbul or Ankara. They complain about our policies in Syria. They complain about our rejection of the weapons programs that they've requested on multiple occasions. They complain about Israel, Gaza. So there's a long list of complaints. My only point is that beyond these tactics, we have and the Turks will play us against the Russians again and again, that we have got to try to keep Turkey firmly in our grip, because if we don't, not only is the NATO alliance a challenge, but having Turkey on the side of terrorists and extremists in the region changes the Middle East calculation entirely. Turkey is a Sunni Muslim country, historically has had a secular presence, and to this day, with all of its problems, still maintains a secular constitution. So on Turkey, I'm agnostic, but I think much of it depends on us and how we try to keep Turkey closer to us. On Israel, I think Israel's role is absolutely vital as the region unfolds in the next 5 to 10 years, not least because for the first time in Israel's history, it is at one with multiple Arab neighbors. So when I'm in the Gulf, it's the first time in my short life that I hear Gulf Arab friends speaking warmly of Israel. The Israelis now have friends in Egypt, in Jordan, even inside parts of Syria, certainly in the Gulf, and that's a good position for Israel to be in. Now the challenge is on Israel as to how you retain that and not frustrate the process in coming years. Much of the friendship, by the way, is to do with the threat that both the Israelis and the Saudis and others face from Iran. So, Israel's position vis-a-vis the West and the Middle East seems a little bit more secure, but Turkey, the jury's out, and much of it depends on how we deal with Turkey and how Turkey wants us to respond to many of its hard-to-meet demands.
We are taking questions online at chi.cnf.io, and we have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to take a couple of questions from here. One of the popular questions is asking, what are your thoughts on the notion of federalization of existing nations across ethnic or religious lines?
I would say I kind of answered that in the first question the lady here asked, that federalization is a long-term way for the region. But that's not to say that nation states are to be abolished. I'm not calling for the abolishing of nation states. All I'm saying is independent nation states can work together, as they have done in the European Union, and by and large peacefully. So there is something to be said. But the big issue underlying all of this is, the constitution of such a federal union for the Middle East has got to be secular. Members of this kind of a broader Middle East have got to be those who do not impose readings of any one religion on its people. So, again, I talk about it extensively in the book. The Middle East Union is something that we've got to think about for the next 125 and 50 years and beyond. So, yes to federalization, but yes to something that's secular and not based on the sectarianism or the imposition of a Muslim Brotherhood ideology or the Iranian Wilayat al-Faqih model.
Great. We'll go towards the back, the gentleman, the fourth row to the end.
Two questions, actually. First one, will the death of Sistani affect the Western policy very much? And the second question is, Ahmad Chalabi, before he died, the Iraqi luminary, said that the West needn't worry about a Arab Shia and Iranian Shia strong alliance, because Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs all know that Gabriel spoke in Arabic when he conveyed the Quran. So what would you say about those two questions?
Very quickly repeat the second one about Gabriel, the Arabic language. So,
Chalabi's point was that the Arabs will never be under the Iranian thumb, that they're nationalist first rather than
in Iraq, got it, right,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. If I take the second one first, I wish I could agree with that, and the reason I disagree with that is twofold. Hezbollah is Arab, and Hamas is Sunni Arab, and they both take instructions directly from Tehran. So my fear is that you could have, Iran is not a linguistic project. Iran's ideology is not about upholding Farsi. My fear is that the ideology that it seeks to export and the imposition and the confrontation that it seeks, it has successfully done that already in Hezbollah's controlled Lebanon. So if Hezbollah, an Arabic-speaking Phoenician/Arab organization, can kowtow to the Iranians by virtue of finance, by virtue of military support, by virtue of seeking a regional alliance, it's wholly logical to assume that others in Iraq may not be the government at this point, but this is an ideology that grows. And indeed Hamas, which is a Sunni Arab organization that bows its head to the Iranians. Now, which brings me to your first point, which I think supports this argument. Sistani, Ayatollah Sistani, a great Muslim scholar, someone who opposes this Wilayat al-Faqih model. Thank you for asking that question, because you've helped reinforce the point I'm making, that most Shia Muslims historically did not believe in the Iranian government model of Wilayat al-Faqih. Sistani is a very prominent Iraqi scholar, great lineage, probably the most heavyweight Muslim Shia scholar, and he rejects that model vehemently, repeatedly. So with his passing, what happens is we lose a pillar, a giant that upheld ancient, continuous Shia tradition that was apolitical and broadly anti-clerics being in politics, anti-theocracy. What we're seeing is a form of theocratic fascism, anti all of that. So I worry about that. And I think my friends in Iraq are always talking about there isn't anyone of Ayatollah Sistani's stature that can come and fill the void that Sistani leaves. And it then begs the question, what does Shia Islam 25, 30 years from now look like if the sources of financing are constantly from the Iranians and the influence into Shia Islam is from the Iranian government? So Sistani and his, he's old and frail now. His passing will leave a large void. And I just hope and pray that someone emerges from that non-Tehran model, but a much more mainstream, peaceful, compassionate, normative Shia scholar that replaces him.
Right at the front here, Steinman. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thanks. I'm curious what you see as the fallout from the United States pulling out of the Iran deal.
Yeah, I was worried about that question coming, and there's a reason why I didn't mention it in the talk. That was intentional. I didn't talk about it intentionally because I know it's divisive, and to be completely honest, I just don't understand the nitty-gritty of the joint, what's it called, the joint comprehensive piece of we should get this right, for joint comprehensive plan of action, exactly, the JCPOA, the P5+1 with Germany. The nitty-gritty of it I don't understand. What I understand is there are key allies in the region, i.e. Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United Arab Emirates, who have repeatedly warned us that the Iranians are not sincere and that the Iranians have a concurrent plan in parts such as Mashhad that isn't on the IAEA's radar. So with those two caveats, my answer is, the ancient Arab saying that, Ahlul Makkah ta'adraku bi shi'abiha, that the people of Mecca know its alleyways best. So for us in Europe and for you in America, if our allies, allies who don't agree on much, the Israelis and the Arabs, if they're both united in telling us there's something at work here, this deal doesn't serve its purpose, you need something much stronger and much more long-lasting, you can't seem to be legitimizing the Iranian government, I think it's therefore right that we honor what our allies are saying. I say, there's another ancient Arab saying that even the dysfunctional clock is right once every 12 hours. So, one doesn't have to say President Trump is right to agree with that Middle East policy, but to just say to you very quickly, if I may, is that when President Obama left office, the Arabs were broadly upset with him. The Turks were definitely upset with him for a whole host of reasons. The Israelis, it goes without saying that they were deeply distressed with him. It was only the Iranians that were genuinely pleased with the Obama administration's Middle East track record. Now think about that. Now we have a situation where the Turks are 50-50 with the US, the Israelis are 100% broadly with the US, and the Arabs are 95% broadly with the US, and the Iranian government is upset. So,
Just going to take a quick question from Conferences.io again. You spoke about many of the countries, but where do the Kurds fit into the question?
Yeah, great question. I think this is one of the most lamentable developments of the Middle East. The Kurds want a state of their own, especially driven by separatist movements in Syria, Iraq, and parts of Turkey. The difficulty is that the Kurdish population is spread in 5 different countries, Armenia, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey. So in a Middle East that's already having problems with many of its nation states, how do you carve out a country out of 5 countries for the Kurdish population? it's a practical question. And secondly, as you've seen from the complaints, I mean, this is one of the complaints that the Turks have constantly vis-a-vis the PKK and the separatist movements in Turkey, but also with the Iraqis and the Syrians exploit the Kurds. I mean, they say the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. And I'm afraid that's where we are with the Kurds. I can't stand here and pretend to you that we, or indeed in the Middle East, there's a solution for the Kurdish problem, other than to say that they be honorable and fully equal citizens in the countries that they currently live in. And all 5 countries that I mentioned have some way to go in order to ensure that their Kurdish populations feel honored and dignified and free.
Let's take some questions. John de Blasio, right at the end. Just wait for the microphone, John, please. Thanks.
So, Ed, the question of Iranian religious values, you talk about Qom and Najaf and sort of the battle for the identification of the future of Shiaism. And I remember my visit to Iran, one of the clerics said, "We don't care about Najaf. They only have 5,000 clerics there. We have 200,000 here in Qom." But the Iranian people that I came into contact with felt that their religious identification had fallen very significantly, and Friday mosque attendance was very low, and people have begun to walk away from Shia Islam and convert in large numbers underground. And it was apparent that the social dynamic in Iran was very, very much away from identification with hardcore Shia Islam and the idea of the connection between the government and religion. Is that a trend that could lead to change politically? And just quickly, as the idea that religion and politics can actually coexist if one is seen as corrupt, how does that play out?
Religion and politics can coexist if one is seen as corrupt. Yeah. Okay, so on the second question, the first question, that's a very important question in terms of wherever you have religion and politics merging and one interpretation being imposed, especially in the modern world, one interpretation being imposed on people, there is almost a direct correlation with the rise of atheism and godlessness and a rejection of religion. I saw this firsthand in Egypt when the Morsi government was in play for just that year and a bit. In Egypt, a very religious country, you very quickly saw people saying, I'm not Muslim anymore. If this is Islam, I don't want anything to do with it. And you saw various Facebook groups, activity on Twitter, and gatherings in Egypt. And if any of you know Egypt, you will know that it's a highly religious country. People are very pious. And piety doesn't mean extremism, but I'll come to that in a minute. So that happened in Egypt. Here, whenever I'm in the US West Coast, I get accosted by Iranians, and they're very keen to preach to me about evangelical Christianity. Almost all of them are people who are running away from the so-called Islamic Republic. There's no such thing as Islamic Republic. It's just a contradiction in terms. A republic is a republic. Why must it be an Islamic Republic? It's an idea taken from ancient Greece. Why must you Islamicize it in 1979? Why can't it just be a secular republic? I digress. But the point is that Iranians who've come to the US, many of them have left Islam and embraced evangelical Christianity, and they're very active with it. Now, similar trends are at place in Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure if that then means that the trend is large enough or strong enough to overthrow the current Iranian regime. I just don't know that. But what I do know is that there are simmerings, there are disappointments. Now there are more frequent protests than there were previously. But I also know that the Iranian regime has its footprints and its handprints across the country in a way that it runs a very tight ship. So on the one hand, I agree with you that I hope it leads to something that removes the current regime and allows the Iranian people to be free. But time will tell whether we end up there. Just think about if your country or your state or your government was run by the Christian whatnot, and you had a plumbing problem or you got a parking ticket, you blame the government for that, and by extension you blame the religious nature of the government for that. You start to lose faith, and this is one of the great achievements of European philosophers, be it John Locke or others, who actually laid out the mental pathway for that separation. Religion and politics must coexist, but they cannot coexist in those who seek to corrupt both. And I say they must coexist because, when you speak to someone like Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia, or when you speak to some of the more sensible elements in Turkey, they always identify two countries that have got a form of secularism that works for them, or pluralism that works for them. This country, which is not hostile to religion, but you have a non-establishment clause. They also highlight my country, saying that this Anglo-Saxon model of secular pluralism is something that Turks, Arabs, and others can benefit from. And I am not just saying this because I'm in the US. I've said this again across the Middle East whenever I speak, and I ask you to go and look at Rashid Ghannouchi's statements. I referenced it and footnoted it all in my book, that he's someone who's very influential in the global Islamist movement, and here he is saying we can accept and embrace and implement the Anglo-Saxon model of secular pluralism, which is not hostile to, in the UK, the Queen is the head of the Church of England. Members of the House of Lords are mandatory, some of them are bishops. So we actually have an established church. You don't. But what you don't have is hostility towards religion, which is something that comes from France. The laicity model, the Rousseau-Voltairean rejection of religion and Catholicism in particular, was a big mistake that was repeated in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and also in Turkey. So there's something to be said about religion having the space to breathe, the oxygen to operate, individuals being pious, but not the government imposing its way. And I'll just end this answer by saying the following. So, for example, and those of you who are confused by what I mean, for example, I'm a Muslim. I don't drink. But that's my choice. I drink alcohol. I'm not recovering or anything. It's just I just don't drink alcohol. But that's just my individual choice, right? And it's, I consider it haram or forbidden, not kosher, if you will. But it's not to be made illegal. I don't want the government to tell me this is legal or illegal. It should not be punishment for me if I decide to then drink. And I can give you tens of Muslim scholars and others who drank historically. That's not the point. The point is that it's not the government's business to come and make halal and haram, personal observation, legal and illegal. That's what Iran does. That's what the Islamist project of the Muslim Brotherhood is about. It's taking your pious observation and making it law. And whenever that happens, hypocrisy starts to emerge. So religion and politics must coexist, and I think that the UK and the US have a model for that, but it must not be shunned from the public space in the way that the French make it happen.
Great. Thank you. That's actually all we have time for. Just a reminder. Ed's book will be available for signing and sale from the bookseller right there. And the cash bar will be open for our networking reception, which will end at 7. So we encourage you to all stay. Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.